The morning came quietly to Portland, not with drama, not with warning, just the slow gray-gold light of an October Tuesday pressing itself against the wet streets of the Pearl District, turning puddles into mirrors, turning ordinary sidewalks into something almost beautiful if you were paying close enough attention. Renata Voss was always paying attention. She had been sitting at the corner table of the Grindstone Café for 11 minutes before the first other customer walked through the door. She knew it was 11 minutes because she had counted not obsessively, not anxiously the way a carpenter counts the grain in a piece of wood, out of habit, out of respect for what the material can tell you if you bother to read it. The table she had chosen was not random. It never was. Corner position. Back to the wall. Clear sightline to the front entrance, the side hallway leading to the restrooms, and the emergency exit behind the counter. 2 potential choke points. 3 viable exit routes if the situation required them. She had run this calculation before she pulled out the chair in the time most people spend deciding whether they want oat milk. She was not proud of this. She was not ashamed of it either. It was simply what her mind did, what it had been doing without pause or apology for 20 years. She had tried in the 2 years since she came home to stop doing it, to sit with her back to the door in restaurants, to walk into rooms without immediately locating the exits, to be a person who trusted spaces rather than auditing them. She had not yet succeeded. Her therapist, a patient woman in Northwest Portland who worked primarily with veterans, had told her that success was not the right metric. Progress was. And on the metric of progress, Renata was doing adequately. She was here at least. That was something. She was sitting in a civilian coffee shop on a Tuesday morning trying to write a professional email rather than somewhere with a security clearance and a satellite phone and a situation requiring her specific capabilities. That was by any reasonable measure progress. The cafe was beginning to fill with its morning regulars. The graduate student in the green fleece who always claimed the same table near the back, arranging her papers with the territorial precision of someone who had fought for that square footage and intended to hold it. The retired couple who split a blueberry scone and never spoke, but smiled at each other whenever they thought the other wasn't looking, a private language of 40 years compressed into these small repeated gestures. The barista with the full sleeve tattoo who moved behind the counter with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made 10,000 lattes and still cared, genuinely cared about making the next one correctly. Renata logged all of them, not consciously. The way a receiver logs signal, because it was built to, because that is the nature of the instrument, and instruments do not take days off. She turned back to her screen. The email had been open for 40 minutes, not because the words were unavailable. She knew exactly what she wanted to say and had known for days. The words had been ready since the 3rd morning. She woke at 4:30 and lay in the dark of her apartment, listening to Portland go about its pre-dawn business, turning the decision over in her hands like an object she was trying to identify by touch alone. The subject line read, "Reconsultation offer 3rd notice." Below it, a name she recognized from 3 separate operational contexts, 2 of which had taken place in locations that did not appear on the maps available to the general public. The offer was generous. The language was careful in the particular way of people who are accustomed to asking for things that require more than a simple yes, who know that directness in certain circumstances is the wrong instrument for the job. They needed someone with her background, her specific operational fluency, her particular competence in environments where things went wrong in ways that could not be managed from a conference room in Virginia. It was the 3rd time they had asked. The first time she had declined within 24 hours. She had been home for 4 months, still learning to sleep past 04:30, still mapping the geography of a city she had chosen precisely because she had no existing associations with it, no history, no ghosts, no streets that meant something she would have to carry. Portland was clean in that sense. It was a place where she could begin the work of becoming someone whose primary daily challenge was not keeping people alive. The second time she had taken a week. She told herself it was because she was busy, which was true in the way that small truths are true, accurate on the surface, not the whole picture underneath. She was building something, a routine, a set of ordinary daily rituals that she hoped would eventually feel like a life rather than a performance of one. Coffee at the Grindstone at 8, a run along the Willamette at noon if the rain allowed. Dinner at home cooked from actual ingredients because cooking required attention, and attention was a resource she had in abundance and needed somewhere to put. The 3rd time this email sitting open on her screen for 11 days now, she had not responded at all. Her cursor rested at the end of a sentence. "Thank you for your continued confidence in my abilities." After careful consideration, she stopped. Outside, a city bus hissed past on Burnside, its windows fogged with commuter breath. A woman walked a yellow Labrador that paused to investigate a gum wrapper with the focused gravity of a forensic specialist. A FedEx driver double-parked with the confidence of a man who had been double-parking on this block for 15 years and considered the practice beyond dispute. Portland in October, wet and quiet and relentlessly stubbornly real. She looked back at the screen. The problem was not the words. The problem was what the words committed her to. Sending this email, this third and final refusal, was not simply declining an offer. It was placing herself on a particular side of a line she had been standing at for 2 years, unable to cross in either direction. It was saying with the finality that written language carries, "This is who I choose to be now." And some part of her, the part that had spent 20 years in service of a very clear and specific identity, did not yet fully trust the new one she was assembling in its place. Because here was the truth she encountered every morning, patient and unchanged at the bottom of whatever she was drinking. She was good at this. Not good in the soft social sense of adequate or capable or reliably effective. Good in the structural sense. The way a load-bearing wall is good, the way a navigation system is good, the way an instrument is good when every component was built for exactly the purpose it serves. 20 years of selection and training and operational deployment had not merely given her skills. They had built her. And the person who had been built was sitting in a Portland coffee shop on an October Tuesday trying to determine whether it was possible to be built differently. She deleted the last 6 words. "Thank you for your continued confidence. After careful consideration, She stopped again. In the corner by the window, a man settled into a chair with the careful, conserving deliberation of someone whose knees had begun to register opinions. He was perhaps 72, perhaps older, the kind of age that carries its history in the body. In the measured way movement happens in the slight forward lean of a frame that had been strong and remembered it. He wore a pressed blue shirt, and his white hair was combed with intention. The grooming of a man who still dressed for going out, even when going out meant only a Tuesday morning coffee. He set a worn leather wallet on the table beside his cup. Brown, old. The leather soft and darkened at the edges from years of handling, not worn out, but worn in the way objects look, when they have been close to a person for a very long time, when they have absorbed something of every day they were present for. He opened it, looked inside. His face did something small and private and not meant for an audience, and Renata looked away immediately with the trained respect for private moments that had survived everything else the training had put into her. She turned back to her screen. After careful consideration, I have decided. The door opened. 3 of them. She knew before they were fully inside. Before she could have articulated the knowing, it was already complete. This was not intuition in the mystical sense. It was pattern, recognition running faster than conscious thought, the accumulated result of thousands of hours of training that had taught her brain to register composite threat indicators the way other brains registered faces or music, the way they entered without pausing. Most people pause at the threshold of a new space. It is an almost universal human behavior. Half a second of orientation, of allowing the eyes to adjust and the environment to register before committing to the room. These 3 entered already moving, already reading, which meant they had been thinking about the room before they arrived. The direction of their eyes. Not upward toward the menu board, not toward the counter or the specials written in chalk on the wall behind the register. Lateral, a deliberate, systematic sweep of the room that was not curiosity, but inventory. The trained civilian eye would read it as a group of young men checking out the space. Renata's eye read it as pre-operational reconnaissance. The position of the largest one's hands buried in the front pocket of his hoodie with the thumbs out. The cafe was warm. A man cold enough to need his hands in his pockets would not be holding his thumbs out like that. That was a concealment in posture, keeping the hands available while keeping them from view. The quality of their silence. 3 people entering a space together generate ambient noise commentary about the line debate, about what to order, the casual, territorial noise of a social group occupying shared space. These 3 were quiet in a way that required active maintenance. Controlled. Purposeful. Renata did not move. Her fingers remained on the keyboard. Her eyes returned to the screen. From the outside, from any outside, she was a woman in her late 40s, checking her email on a quiet Tuesday morning, unremarkable, absorbed, precisely the kind of person who does not register as a variable in anyone's calculation. Inside, something had shifted, quietly and completely and without drama. The portion of her mind that had been wrestling with the email stepped aside, and another part stepped forward, not urgently, not with adrenaline, but with the clean, impersonal focus of an instrument coming into calibration. She filed them one at a time. The leader, tall, lean, early 20s. A face that suggested intelligence, not the soft intelligence of someone who had been told they were smart, but the sharper kind, the calculating kind, the kind that is always running scenarios 2 or 3 moves ahead. His eyes moved with patience. He was not rushing the assessment. He knew that rushing was how you made mistakes. The large one broad through the chest and shoulders, 22 at most. His role was already legible. He was not here to think. He was here to represent consequence, to be the physical fact that made objections seem inadvisable. The third younger looking than the others, or perhaps just less armored. 2021. He stood slightly behind the other two, not fully occupying the space he was in, with the specific body language of someone who has committed to a decision they are not entirely certain of present, but not yet all the way in. None of them ordered anything. The leader walked to the counter, examined the menu board for approximately 4 seconds, then turned away without ordering and began a slow, apparently aimless circuit of the room. Renata watched him in her peripheral vision with the dispassion of a naturalist observing behavior in the field. He was good. She gave him that without sentiment. His movement had a practiced casualness, a man with nowhere particular to be drifting, killing time. He stopped to look at a framed photograph on the wall near the hallway. He checked his phone. He rocked slightly on his heels, with the body language of boredom. All of it calibrated, all of it costing more effort than genuine boredom costs. But his eyes were not the eyes of a bored man. They moved with the economy of focused purpose, landing and lifting, cataloging without lingering. A leather purse on the back of a chair unzipped its owner deep in a conversation on her phone. A newer model iPhone face-up on a two-top its owner, staring out the window with the 1,000-yard gaze of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere. An open laptop, expensive its owner at the counter, ordering a second drink. The geometry of inattention systematically mapped. His circuit brought him toward the windows. Toward the corner table where the older man in the blue shirt was sitting with his wallet on the table beside his coffee. He slowed almost imperceptibly. His eyes landed on the wallet, old leather, worn visibly real, and then moved on. Past the wallet, past Walt Calloway, to her. She felt the moment his assessment arrived. He made no gesture, changed nothing in his pace or expression. But she had been present at enough moments of selection to recognize the quality of attention that says this one. It had a different texture than general surveillance. It had the quality of a decision. She was a woman alone, late 40s, simply dressed in clothes that said nothing in particular. A designer tote on the empty chair across from her, real leather, recognizable brand, the vocabulary of disposable income to anyone who spoke that language. A phone on the table, newest model, no case. A laptop worth a quick calculation. To his eye, distracted, solitary, surrounded by portable value. To his eye, the perfect mark. She watched him in her peripheral field give a signal to the large one across the room. Minimal, a fractional tilt of the chin, the kind of signal that only exists if you already know to look for it. The plan assembled itself in her reading of the room. She had seen variations of this in 6 countries, and too many operational contexts to count, always the same architecture, distraction and displacement and extraction. Create a scene. Move on the target while attention goes to the noise. Be gone before the noise resolves. Simple, repeatable, effective against everyone it was designed to be effective against. She returned to her screen. After careful consideration, I have decided. She thought briefly about finishing the sentence. About the version of this morning in which she completed the email and sent it, and sat back and drank her coffee, and this was simply a Tuesday. About retirement as a state that meant what the word was supposed to mean, a clean withdrawal from the kind of situations she had spent 20 years walking toward. She was retired. She had given what she was asked to give, and then given more. And at the end of 20 years, she had walked away with her body largely intact in a set of skills she was actively trying not to need. This was not her responsibility. These were not her people. The large one, positioning himself near the hallway, was not her problem. And the quiet third one, standing near the door with his hands visible and his face slightly too still, was not her problem. And the leader completing his circuit and beginning his approach toward her table was absolutely not her problem. She watched Walt Calloway in the corner wrap both hands around his coffee cup and look out the window at the October street with the specific stillness of a man who has learned to be alone with himself and is making his peace with it this morning like every morning. She looked at the wallet beside his cup. She looked at his hands. She looked at her screen. After careful consideration, I have decided the large one lurched out of the hallway. Hard, deliberate. His shoulder catching the passing waitress with calculated force, the tray leaving her hands and the cups leaving the tray, and the sound that followed, filling the entire cafe sharp, sudden, enormous. The violence of ceramic on concrete multiplied by the quiet. It was breaking into, and the waitress's cry, cutting across it all, like something that had been held back and could no longer be. Every head in the room turned. The part of Renata's mind that had been composing an email went offline. Another part step forward, not with a drama, not with the physiological surge that adrenaline was supposed to produce and which her body had long since learned to metabolize differently, converting it not into panic or aggression, but into a narrowing, a sharpening the compression of attention into a single clean beam. She had 3 seconds. Her peripheral vision, not a passive instrument, a trained one honed over 20 years of needing to know what was happening, in the space she was not directly looking at, tracked the leader's full approach. 3 strides, fast and practiced. His right hand already extending, already reaching for the strap of the tote bag on the chair across from her, his fingers closing on the leather with the confidence of a man who has done this before and has never once had the transaction go wrong. She let him get close enough to fully commit. His fingers closed on the strap, and then she moved. Not explosively, not with the signaling urgency of someone reacting to surprise. She moved the way a mechanism moves when the trigger is pulled, inevitably completely all at once. Her right hand came off the keyboard and found his wrist before his grip could tighten thumb, locating the pressure point with the accuracy of something that had been practiced past the point of thought into the territory of pure physical grammar. She pulled him forward into his own momentum, physics doing the work, his center of gravity shifting ahead of his feet. His face meeting the table with the full cooperative weight of a body that had been traveling in that direction and simply arrived at its destination. The napkin dispenser registered an objection. He made a sound, pain, and astonishment, combined the astonishment greater than the pain, the sound of someone whose map of the situation has just been revealed as catastrophically wrong. Less than 2 seconds had passed since his fingers touched the strap. Greer Webb came out of the hallway at speed. Big men in motion have a particular quality, all forward commitment, all mass and velocity, trusting that mass and velocity will be sufficient because they have generally been sufficient before. He came at her like something that had decided to be a fact. She was not where he expected her to be. She sidestepped with the minimum of movement required, not dramatic, not showy, simply an efficient use of geometry, opening a space precisely the width of his body and stepping into the adjacent space. As he committed past her 220 pounds of forward momentum, looking for something to land on, she placed her open hand in the small of his back, firm, timed to the exact moment of maximum commitment. She did not push him, she redirected what was already happening. His own momentum carried him into the vacant table against the wall. The table went over with a sound that was conclusive metal and wood, and the weight of a large man in full flight meeting concrete floor with the authority of an ending. Silence. Real silence. The specific silence that follows something that moved too fast for comprehension when the room is still processing the last 3 seconds and has not yet caught up to the present one. Theo Malone, the youngest one, the one who had never been fully committed to the space he was standing in, was already gone. He had turned for the door somewhere in the preceding 30 seconds and made it through before the silence fully settled. Renata stood in the center of the room. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken a visible sweat. Her breathing was elevated but controlled the breathing of someone who has exerted herself, not the breathing of someone who has been frightened. The tote bag sat on the chair where she had left it. Her phone was on the table where she had left it. Her coffee had not spilled. She looked down at Calzer-Briggs' cheek pressed against the surface of her table, processing what had just happened with the focused intensity of someone running new data against an existing model and finding that the model requires revision. Her voice was level, conversational, entirely free of performance. That was a poor decision. She released his wrist and in the same motion, without any break in the fluid logic of her movement, hooked her foot around his ankle in a way that removed the option of running before running could become a thought. He went to the floor with the controlled inevitability of something that had been structurally determined from the moment his fingers closed on the leather strap. She stood over him, not looming, not performing dominance. Simply present the way a wall is present, the way a fact is present, without requiring your agreement or your acknowledgement to remain exactly what it is. Behind her, Greer Webb was untangling himself from the ruins of the overturned table, holding one shoulder, the aggression draining out of him with the speed of a man whose body has just provided him with information his mind had not previously had access to. The cafe was utterly still, not the comfortable stillness of a room at rest. The held, astonished stillness of a room that has witnessed something. It does not have immediate language for something that has shifted the air in a way everyone present can feel, and almost no one can name. Renata held out one hand palm up. Her face held the same expression it had worn while composing an email present, focused entirely unimpressed by the drama of the last 3 seconds. The wallet, she said. It was not a question. It was the simplest possible statement of what came next. Calder-Briggs stared up at her from the floor with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before in very different places and much higher stakes circumstances, the expression of someone who has just discovered that the map they were using to navigate the world was drawn by someone who had never visited the territory. In the corner of the room, Walt Calloway sat completely still, both hands around his coffee cup, watching the woman standing in the center of the room with an expression located somewhere between incomprehension and recognition. His wallet sat on the table beside him, exactly where he had left it. Outside on the wet Portland street, a siren started. Distant at first, then closer, then close enough to matter. Renata did not look toward the sound. She kept her attention on Calder-Briggs on the floor and waited with the patience of a person who understood that the moment was not yet finished and had nowhere else to be. The sirens arrived before the room had finished exhaling, two of them close together, the sound compressing as the cruisers turned onto the block and pulled to the curb. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights made the wet pavement blink red, then blue, then red again, turning the ordinary Tuesday morning into something people would describe to their families at dinner. Renata had already stepped back from Calder-Briggs by the time the door opened. Not far. Enough. The geometry of her position communicated without words. What needed to be communicated? She was not a threat. She was not fleeing. She was a person present in a room where something had occurred and was waiting with complete composure for the people whose professional responsibility was to sort it out. Sergeant Brett London came through the door first. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, the build of a man who had once been in excellent condition and had arrived at a reasonable settlement with time. His face had a particular quality that Renata recognized from a specific kind of long service, not hardened exactly, but settled. A face that had processed enough of what human beings do to each other that it no longer wasted resources on being surprised by incremental new entries in the catalog. His eyes moved through the room with a professional economy that she recognized because she had been trained to the same economy. His partner Younger was already moving toward Greer Webb, who sat against the wall with one hand on his shoulder and the expression of a man conducting an urgent inventory of his previous assumptions. London stopped inside the door. He read the room the way she had read it an hour earlier, the same systematic triage, the same rapid sorting of relevant from irrelevant, the same practiced prioritization of attention. His eyes moved across the overturned table across Calder on the floor, with his wrist now zip-tied across the waitress being attended to by two customers near the counter, across the faces of the morning regulars who had been turned into witnesses, and then across the woman standing in the center of all of it. He held on her a beat longer than the rest, not with suspicion, with recognition. The specific recognition that does not require prior acquaintance, the recognition of a particular kind of human being by someone who has spent enough time around that kind to know one by the way they occupy a room. The stillness, the economy, the absence of the residual tremor that civilians carry after something violent has happened near them. He walked toward her. Garrett was behind him, his voice elevated with the specific energy of a man who had managed this cafe for 4 years without once imagining he would be giving a statement to police officers about what had happened inside it. London stopped in front of Renata. His voice was professional, measured a question asked for record rather than performance. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Before she could answer, the woman at the nearest table leaned forward over her cup, needing to contribute what she had seen. She stopped at them, all three. She barely moved, and they were on the floor. From 2 tables over, the retired man whose blueberry scone sat untouched. She didn't raise her voice, not once the entire time. London absorbed these without visible reaction. His eyes returned to Renata. She gave him a factual account. Sequential, unembellished, entirely free of the self-aggrandizement or false modesty that colored most civilian accounts of events people had been personally involved in. 3 subjects entered. Pre-operational surveillance consistent with targeting for theft. Distraction technique executed. Subjects moved on identified targets. She intervened. She described her actions the way a technician describes a procedure, this instrument, this application, this result. When she finished, London was quiet for a moment. His eyes dropped to her left wrist. The silver bracelet had shifted during the preceding events. Beneath it, partially visible, a small tattoo. A trident, Faded the way ink fades when it has been living inside skin for 2 decades, the lines softer than they once were, the meaning undiminished. He looked back up. Navy, he said. Not a question. An identification. 20 years, Renata said. One nod. Compact. The acknowledgement of a man who understood what 20 years meant and was not going to make a speech about it. He did not ask more than that. He recognized with the professional instinct of a long-serving officer that there were things he was not going to be told, and he accepted this without resentment, the way experienced people accept the existence of doors that are closed for reasons that have nothing to do with them. He turned his attention to Calder Briggs sitting on the floor, wrists secured, watching everything with an expression that had shifted considerably since the moment his face had made contact with the table. The operational arrogance was gone. In its place was something more unexpected, a quiet, concentrated focus. He was thinking hard, not about escape, not about consequences in the immediate sense, about what had happened, about the gap between what he had believed would occur and what had actually occurred, and what the size of that gap said about the accuracy of his existing model of the world. London crouched to his level. Son, he said, and the word was not warm, but it was not cruel. I need you to tell me where the rest of it is. Calder said nothing, but his body language was not defiant. It was the body language of someone who has already run the math and arrived at an answer they are not yet ready to speak. London straightened. His partner began the methodical work of checking pockets, and what emerged built its own story without narration. A slim card wallet belonging to the graduate student in the green fleece, who pressed her hand over her mouth when she recognized it. A Visa card belonging to the retired man at the window, who had not yet noticed its absence. 3 folded bills, taken from a jacket left over a chair by a man who had trusted the room the way people trust rooms that have given them no reason not to. And then from inside Calder's jacket, a worn brown wallet with a leather that was soft and darkened at the edges from years of daily handling. Renata was watching Walt Calloway's face when it appeared. The old man had been standing to one side of the room, slightly apart from the other customers, leaning on his cane and watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone trying to assemble a coherent picture from available evidence. When London's partner held up the wallet, Walt made a sound, small, involuntary. Not quite a word, the sound of something catching in the chest before the mind has fully caught up. He had not known it was gone. He had been so entirely focused on the extraordinary thing he had watched happen in the middle of this ordinary room that he had never thought to check the table beside him, had never registered the absence of the thing he reached for by reflex every morning, the thing that had been in his pocket or on the nearest surface every day for 50 years. London crossed the room and held it out with both hands. As if it deserved that, Walt took it the same way. Both hands. Held it against his chest, eyes closing for a moment that was long enough to be real and brief enough to be dignified. Then he opened his eyes, straightened, and nodded at London with the gravity of a man acknowledging something that cannot be fully articulated and does not require articulation. Then he looked across the room at Renata. His eyes were the faded blue of a winter sky, and they held in them the specific quality that age sometimes produces, not diminishment, but accumulation. A lifetime of experience looking outward through them, and what it saw when it looked at her was not the gratitude a person extends to someone who has retrieved a lost item. It was something considerably larger and less easily categorized. He nodded at her. Once, slowly. She nodded back. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. Some exchanges happen before language is ready for them. London returned to her side. He had been running something on his phone, a name, a database, a public record, and when he looked at the results, something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, the particular expression of a person receiving information that clarifies rather than shocks. He turned the screen toward her. Calder Briggs, 23. No prior convictions. One prior contact, a trespass citation 18 months ago, charges subsequently dropped. Current address, a rooming house in Southeast Portland. And then the record that was not criminal history but academic history, retrieved from university, records that had never been sealed because there was no reason to seal them. Oregon State University, admitted on full academic scholarship. Electrical engineering, GPA at the time of withdrawal 3.91. Reason for withdrawals stated in the registrar's notation, financial hardship, family circumstances. He had been 19 years old when he left. Renata looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked across the room at Calder Briggs, sitting against the wall with his wrists secured, and his eyes on the floor and his mind visibly running calculations that had nothing to do with the immediate situation and everything to do with something larger. She was not constructing an excuse for him. She was not in the business of softening the edges of actions by attaching sympathetic histories to the people who performed them. She had known in her operational life enough people who had suffered genuine hardship and declined to solve it through the exploitation of strangers. Hardship was context, not absolution. But she was also a person who had spent 20 years reading situations completely, and the complete reading of Calder Briggs included a 23-year-old with a 391 GPA who had been heading somewhere and had gotten knocked off course at 19 by circumstances that had nothing to do with his choices, and had been navigating the wreckage of that derailment by the only means that had presented themselves, which was not justification. It was information. London put his phone away. "Damn shame," he said quietly. 2 words with the weight of a longer sentence. Renata said nothing. She was watching Calder, the set of his jaw, the quality of his stillness, the way his eyes moved when he glanced up occasionally at the room. He was not deflated. That was the thing she could not stop returning to. Most people, when situations collapsed around them, did something predictable. Scrambled, denied, performed victimhood, looked for the version of events in which they were not the primary agent of their own disaster. Calder Briggs was doing none of that. He was thinking. The same focused, patient, scenario-running intelligence she had read in his face during his circuit of the room was still running, recalibrated to new data. He was trying to understand what had happened. He needed to understand it before he could decide what it meant. Greer Webb was considerably louder. Greer was performing the expected script lawyer writes grievances, the theatrical indignation of a man who believes volume is a functional substitute for leverage. London's partner handled him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had heard every variation of this performance and knew exactly where it went. Then the door opened again. Not an officer, not another customer arriving into an unusual morning. Theo Malone came through the door slowly. The way people enter rooms when they are not certain they will be permitted to stay, shoulders slightly forward, hands out from his odds invisible, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has thought about each step before taking it. He stopped inside the entrance, looked at the officers, at Calder and Greer, at the room full of faces turning toward him. His eyes found Renata. He did not look at her with fear. He did not look at her with whatever remained of the operational defiance he had arrived with. He looked at her the way a person looks at the one fixed and reliable point in a room that is moving too fast, the one thing that has been identified as stable when everything else is not. London's hand moved toward the zip ties at his belt. "I want to turn myself in," Theo said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not from fear alone. From the effort of saying something that cost him more than running had. London's hand stopped. Theo walked toward him, slowly, arms slightly away from his body, every signal his body could transmit, transmitting the same message: I am not a threat, I am not running. I am here, I am choosing this. The younger officer took his arm and guided him to a chair with a gentleness that acknowledged what the gesture had cost. Theo sat down. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his face tipped toward the floor for a long moment, very still. Then he raised his head and looked at Renata. She was standing 8 feet away, and she was giving him the same complete, open, receiving attention she had given to everything else this morning. Not judgment, not performance, just full presence, the kind that does not manufacture warmth it does not have, but does not withhold attention either. He said it quietly. Addressed not to the room, but to her, or perhaps to himself, though in the silence of the cafe it carried clearly. My grandfather did 2 tours, Korea. He used to say the most dangerous men he ever met were the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need to prove anything. He looked at his hands. I've been thinking about that my entire life, and I didn't understand what he meant until about 15 minutes ago. The room held its breath around him. The espresso machine produced a brief hiss of steam. On Burnside, a truck moved through an intersection. October light continued its patient work through the cafe windows. Theo raised his head again. His voice had steadied, though the effort behind the steadiness was visible. I don't know exactly why I came back. I was halfway down the block, and I couldn't keep going in that direction. It felt like something I would spend the rest of my life trying to outrun. He paused. I've seen what that looks like. I didn't want it. Renata looked at him for a long, full moment. Something shifted in her face. Small, not dramatic. The involuntary softening that occurs when a person hears something genuine and receives it as such, when the guard that is always partly up comes down just slightly in acknowledgement of something real being offered. Sitting back down, she said quietly, is harder than running. Most people don't do it. Remember that you did. Theo held her gaze for several seconds. Then he nodded once with the solemnity of someone receiving something they intend to keep and looked back at his hands. London had watched the exchange from a careful distance. He was the kind of officer who understood that some things happened better without official participation, that his job in certain moments was to be present without crowding what was occurring. He stepped beside Renata. "This one's different," he said. Below the general register of the room. "Yes," she said, "from the other two." Considerably. He considered this. He was a man who took facts seriously and did not hurry toward conclusions about them. "We'll see," he said. "Different doesn't always turn out to be enough. Sometimes it does." He nodded the nod of a man who had been at this long enough to know that both statements were true and that there was no reliable formula for knowing which applied in a given case. You read what you could read. You processed what you were responsible for processing. You went home. You did not always learn how it ended. The room was finding its way back to something like itself. The graduate student had retrieved her card wallet, her hands still slightly unsteady, her face carrying the particular expression of someone rethinking several previously held assumptions about the safety of inattention. The retired couple had confirmed the return of their credit card and were now seated closer together than they had been before, the man's hand resting on the woman's arm with the ease of a gesture that had been made 10,000 times before this one. Garrett was giving his statement to the younger officer in a voice descending steadily in pitch as the adrenaline metabolized. And then Walt Calloway was beside her. He had crossed the room quietly, and she had not tracked his approach, which told her something about where her attention had traveled during the preceding minutes, and she filed that information with the rest. He stopped beside her with the deliberation of a man who has decided what he needs to say and intends to say it properly. "May I?" he said, and opened the wallet without quite waiting for the answer. Inside, behind a small plastic window on the left, a photograph. Studio taken. Standard size. A woman, perhaps 65 when it was taken, white hair cut short and neat, a face that carried its beauty differently than youth carries beauty accumulated, specific evidence of a life lived with generosity toward other people and toward itself. Her eyes were warm, and the smile on her face had the quality of a smile that arrived just before the shutter in response to something real. Walt looked at the photograph for a moment the private way. Then he looked at Renata. "Eleanor," he said, 53 years. He said it the way people say things they have said so many times that the words have become transparent, carrying the meaning directly without any wrapping around it. "She passed in March." 3 words. No softening phrases, no the customary linguistic distance people use when the plain fact of loss is too direct to let stand unmediated. Just "she passed in March," the fact in its full weight. "I carry this," he said, meaning the wallet, meaning the photograph, because when I'm somewhere ordinary, a cafe, the grocery store, just walking there, are moments when I need to remember that it was real, that she was real, that it happened. He paused. "When you get to my age, the good things can start to feel like they might have been a long time ago in a place you can't quite locate anymore." Renata was very still. She was listening the way she listened when it mattered completely, without the portion of her mind that normally ran concurrent processing of what she would say next. Just receiving. "I didn't know it was gone," Walt said. "I was watching what you did, and it didn't occur to me to check beside me, and then the officer held it up, and I—" He stopped, looked across the room toward where Calder had sat, toward the table now empty and slightly displaced from its original position. "I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't come back." He looked at her directly. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Plain. No performance, no the embellishment of a man trying to make his gratitude large enough to match what he felt. Just the genuine article delivered simply the way real things are delivered by people who have learned to dispense with the decorative. Renata opened her mouth. The reflex was there, the practiced deflection, the half-modesty of a professional. "I was just here. Anyone would have. It was nothing." All of it partly true, and all of it a way of not fully receiving what was being offered. She had been doing it for 20 years. She was good at it. She closed her mouth. "I'm glad I was here," she said, and meant it in a direction that surprised her. Not the professional meaning, not the reflexive meaning, but the actual one located somewhere specific and genuine, the meaning that lived below the ones she was more accustomed to. She was glad she was here. Walt looked at her for another moment. Then he smiled, not the small, polite social smile of an exchange concluding properly, but the full, warm, private smile of a person who has just understood something. It arrived from somewhere behind his eyes and came forward without asking permission. He patted her hand once, lightly. The touch of an older person acknowledging something real without making a ceremony of it. Then he turned and made his way back to his corner table, moving with the unhurried dignity of a man who has somewhere to be and is in no rush to arrive. Renata watched him go. London appeared beside her one final time. Notebook closing, the small mechanical sound of official business concluding. Number, he said, for a follow-up statement if we need one. She gave it to him. He wrote it down. Then he looked at her directly briefly, the paperwork done, the officer setting aside to make room for something less procedural. 20 years is a long time to carry something, he said. Then you put it down and you don't know what to do with your hands. It landed. The way true things land when they are delivered without performance. Yeah, she said. London put his pen away, settled his jacket, turned toward the door. At the threshold, without turning back, thank you for your service. The door closed. The cafe returned to itself, not to what it had been before exactly, because rooms that have held extraordinary things are never quite the same room afterward, but to something that functioned like normality. The sounds and rhythms of a morning, resuming the hiss of the espresso machine, and the low current of resumed conversations, and the small reliable noises of people getting on with a Tuesday that had briefly been something else. Renata stood in the center of it. Her coffee was cold. Garrett was already behind the counter making something new. She walked back to her table. The laptop screen had gone dark in her absence. She woke it. The email was still open. The cursor blinked steadily after the same unfinished words, patient as a tide. After careful consideration, I have decided. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the room. At the graduate student, hands flat on the table, staring at the wall with the expression of someone who's thinking about something important, had been permanently reconfigured by the last 40 minutes. At the retired couple chairs closer together, the man's hand on the woman's arm. At Walt Calloway and his corner wallet closed and settled on the table, hands around his coffee cup, looking out at the Portland street with a quality of attention that was subtly different from the quality it had carried an hour ago. At Theo Malone, alone in his chair now, the officer having moved on, sitting with himself in the way a person sits with themselves when they have made a significant choice and are living in the first quiet minutes of what comes after it. Renata put her hands back on the keyboard. The cursor blinked. Outside on the wet street, the police cruisers were gone. A cyclist moved through the intersection in rain gear. A woman pushed a stroller past the window. The city continued at its own pace, unconcerned with the particular weight of what had shifted inside the room behind the glass. She looked at the screen and thought about what she needed to say. The cafe breathed. That was the only word for it, the specific exhale of a space that has been holding something and is now slowly releasing it. The espresso machine cycled. The music from the corner speaker, silent to everyone for the past 40 minutes, became audible again. Something quiet and acoustic, a guitar doing nothing complicated, present without insisting on being noticed. Renata sat with her hands on the keyboard. She was not stuck. She was not avoiding. She was doing something she had spent 2 years learning to recognize as distinct from both sitting with what had happened, letting it settle, the way water settles when you stop disturbing it, waiting for the picture to clarify on its own terms without forcing it into a shape she had decided in advance. The morning had not gone the way she planned. This was not a new experience. 20 years of operational work had consisted almost entirely of mornings that dissolved their plans within the first 10 minutes in the central skill she had developed, the one she believed had kept her functional. When others with equal training had not been as fortunate, was not the ability to fight or to endure, though both had been required. It was the ability to look at what was actually present, rather than what she had expected to find, and respond to reality rather than her projection of it. She looked at what was actually present, a cold cup of coffee, an unfinished sentence. A room full of people who had arrived as strangers and been made briefly into something that had no single clean name, witnesses, participants, people who would carry the specific texture of this Tuesday into the rest of their lives, whether or not they chose to, and her own hands resting on the keyboard waiting. She opened a new document, not a response to anyone outside this room, not a draft of something she would eventually send, a blank field entirely private, the kind of space you create when you need to say something to yourself before you can say it anywhere else. She began to type, slowly at first, following a thread she had only just located. She wrote, "I'm good at this." Not good in the way the word usually gets used, adequate, reliable, impressively capable on a good day. Good in the structural sense, the load-bearing sense. 20 years built something specific. I have been asking for 2 years whether being capable of a thing creates a permanent obligation to that thing. Whether the fact that I was built for this means I owe the world the use of it indefinitely until I have nothing left. She stopped. Read it back. Then below it, that is the wrong question. The question of what I owe is not the question. The question is what I choose. Those are not the same thing. I have spent 2 years treating them as if they were and wondering why I couldn't find an answer. The confusion was the problem, not the inability. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a cloud crossed the sun. The light in the cafe shifted from gold to the flat, even gray of overcast sky, then back to gold as the cloud continued on its way. 30 seconds. The room unchanged. She wrote a third line. I do not know yet what I will decide. But I know the difference now between a decision I am making and a decision I am waiting for the world to make for me. I have been waiting. That ends today. Not with an answer, with the willingness to be the one who chooses. She saved the document, closed it. The email remained open in the background. She left it there, not from avoidance, but from the genuine recognition that the answer was not ready, and forcing it before it was ready would only produce the wrong one. She had time. The answer would form when it had enough material to form from, and this morning had given it a considerable amount of new material to work with. Garrett appeared beside her table. She had not heard him approach, which was information filed quietly alongside everything else. He set a fresh cup in front of her, without ceremony, without the elaborate presentation of someone who needs the gesture to be noticed. Just set it down the way you do something for a person you have decided to take care of, without making a production of the decision. On the house, he said, for as long as you want to keep coming in. She looked at the cup, then at him. He met her eyes without performance, a man who had said what he meant and had nothing to add to it. Thank you, she said. She meant it in several directions at once, and something in her tone carried this because he acknowledged it with a small nod that received more than the surface of the words before he returned to the counter. She picked up the cup, drank. It was genuinely good. Made by someone who understood that caring about the result was visible in the result every time, regardless of whether anyone was watching closely enough to notice. She drank it without hurry, without the fractional inattention of someone whose mind is simultaneously somewhere else. Across the room, Theo Malone was still in his chair. The younger officer had finished with him and moved on. Theo sat alone, not on his phone, not scanning the room. Sitting with himself, the particular solitude of someone who has made a significant and costly choice and is now living in the first quiet minutes of its aftermath, taking stock of what it actually feels like to have done the harder thing. Renata watched him. She thought about the specific cost of what he had done, not abstractly, the actual physical experience of stopping momentum that was carrying you away from something difficult and choosing to reverse it. The distance back was always longer than the distance away. This was not a coincidence. It was a feature of the geometry of difficult choices built in to ensure that the people who made them had actually decided rather than drifted in the right direction by accident. She stood up, gathered her things with the quiet efficiency that was simply her no wasted motion, no performance of departure. She walked to the table where Calder Briggs had sat, empty now, the chair slightly displaced from where it had been when he was walked out. A coffee cup that had never been used sat at the edge, placed there by the habit of a cafe that sets cups in front of people, whether or not those people have any intention of staying. Renata reached into her bag and took out the small notepad she carried, tore a page. From memory, she wrote a phone number. Below it, 2 words, the name of a program run by a woman she had deployed with in her final year of service, who had come home 2 years before Renata and spent those years building something in Portland. Small, chronically underfunded, difficult to scale, stubbornly effective. It worked with young people who had records and intact minds and the specific kind of potential that institutional systems were structurally designed not to see, and it had changed the direction of enough lives that its founder no longer needed to argue for its existence. She looked at the piece of paper. Then she thought about the fact that Calder Briggs was in a police cruiser and would not be returning to this table. She picked up the paper and walked to Garrett at the counter. The young man they took out, she said. Calder Briggs. When someone comes in asking about what happened here and someone will a family member, a public defender, someone can you hold on to this for them? Garrett looked at the paper, looked at her. I'll hold on to it, he said. No further questions. The response of a person who understands enough about a situation to know that understanding more is not required. She turned back toward the room. At Theo's table, she stopped. He looked up as she arrived beside him, and she gave him her full attention. The real kind, the kind that does not perform interest, but simply has it. The program your grandfather described, she said. The quiet ones. You know what made them quiet? He waited. They had already decided who they were, she said. They weren't still running the argument. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone, including themselves, because the question was settled. That's not something you're born with, it's something you decide. She held his gaze for a beat. You made a decision today. Don't waste the momentum it gives you. These things have a half-life if you don't act on them. Theo looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not comfort exactly, not resolution, but the expression of a person who has been handed something true and is already beginning to take its measure, already beginning to figure out what it requires of him. Okay, he said, simple, the word of someone who means it. She moved toward the door. Miss, Walt Calloway's voice from the corner. She turned. He was at his table in his pressed blue shirt, both hands around his coffee cup. The brown leather wallet sat closed on the table beside him. In front of him was a piece of paper covered in his handwriting and a pen set to one side with the precision of a man who has completed something and set down his instrument deliberately knowing he was done. She crossed the room to him. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the paper in front of him, then folded it along a careful crease, not hiding it, closing it the way you close a letter that belongs now to the person it was written for, and held it between his hands. I have been trying to write to Eleanor for 7 months, he said. No preamble, no management of the moment, just the plain statement of a fact he had arrived at peace with. There were things I should have said differently, the right content but the wrong register. She always knew what I meant. He looked at the folded paper. But knowing what someone means and hearing the thing you needed to hear, those aren't always the same thing. And I kept thinking I had more time to find the right words. He was quiet for a moment. 7 months. I would start and stop, start and stop. Too formal it sounded like I was writing to a person I respected but didn't know. Too unguarded it felt like I was using the letter to take care of myself rather than to say something real to her. He set the folded paper on the table. I was trying to write to the version of her I was equal to, as though she had ever wanted that version. He looked at Renata directly. This morning, watching you, not the action, not that specifically, watching you exist in this room as exactly and entirely what you are. No management of the presentation. No gap between the person and what the person shows. I realized I had been trying to write to Eleanor from a managed distance. He touched the edge of the folded paper. She would have had no patience for that. She never did. She used to say the most exhausting people she knew were the ones who spent all their energy on how they appeared instead of simply appearing. Renata said nothing. She was listening with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered, without the concurrent processing, without the part of her mind that was assembling a response before the other person had finished speaking. Just present, just receiving. I wrote it this morning as myself, Walt said. The actual version. The one that never got as patient as I meant to be, the one who said things wrong, sometimes the one who wasn't grateful enough on the ordinary days when gratitude would have been so easy. He paused. She knew all of that. She chose it anyway for 53 years. Writing to anything less was an insult to what she actually chose. He opened the wallet. Inside, behind the plastic window, Eleanor, the portrait studio photograph, perhaps 65 when it was taken. White hair cut short, warm eyes, the smile of a woman who had been laughing at something real, just before the shutter caught her. He looked at the photograph for a moment that was long enough to be genuine. Then he folded the letter once more and placed it carefully inside the wallet beside the photograph. Eleanor and the words traveling together now. He closed the wallet. 53 years, he said quietly, and I still find new things. Then he looked at her, and the smile that arrived was the full, warm, private one, originating from somewhere behind his eyes, coming forward without asking permission. Thank you, he said, not for the wallet, for the reminder that the complete version of a person is enough, more than enough. Renata met his eyes. The reflex was there, the professional deflection, the half-modesty, the practiced way of receiving gratitude without fully letting it land. It had served her well for a long time. It had also, she recognized, now been a way of staying at a remove from things that deserved to be felt directly. She let it land. I'm glad I was here, she said. Below the words, the actual meaning, she was glad in the specific way, in the direction that surprised her, in the genuine sense of a person who was exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were made for, with the full weight of everything they were behind it. Walt held her gaze for a moment. Then he held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was the grip of a man whose hands had done decades of real work and carried the memory of it. Come back sometime, he said. Just for coffee. No emergencies required. I will, she said. She meant it. She stood, walked to the door. At the threshold she paused, not from hesitation, from the trained practice of registering endings of giving, last moments the attention they were owed. because she had learned over 20 years that the last things you saw in a place were sometimes the things you carried longest. She looked back. The graduate student in the green fleece bent over her notes with a focused intensity that had an edge to it, now the edge of someone who's thinking about something fundamental had been permanently revised by the last hour. The retired couple chairs moved close to the man's hand on the woman's arm, with the ease of a gesture that had been made 10,000 times before this morning and would be made 10,000 times more. Garrett behind the counter, moving through the work of the afternoon setup with the quiet care of a person who finds meaning in doing things properly when no one is requiring them to. Theo Malone in his chair, the younger officer back beside him, not in official capacity, now just sitting, two people working something out together at the pace it actually required. And Walt Calloway in his corner, the wallet in his breast pocket now close to him, his hands around the coffee cup. His eyes on the window on the street on the Portland morning's forward-facing present, the eyes of a man who had finished something important and was waiting with a patience that was not resignation, but genuine openness to see what the next thing would be. Renata pushed the door open. The bell chimed the same clear note it struck for everyone who passed through unremarkable, reliable present. She stepped outside. The air received her. Cool and carrying the specific quality of Portland, in October, clean and faintly damp. The smell of wet concrete and the yellow leaves coming off the street trees. The distant green exhalation of a city with enough trees still to remember what it used to be. The sun was higher than when she had arrived. The light had moved from the low morning gold to the fuller, cleaner brightness of mid-morning, the kind that makes surfaces look like themselves rather than like what you might want them to be. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not moving, just standing in the October air present, without agenda, occupying the space she was in, without immediately converting it into a problem to be navigated. A woman walked past with a stroller and nodded with the brief, sufficient courtesy of strangers sharing a sidewalk. A cyclist moved through the intersection wearing full rain gear with the calm adaptation of someone who had made peace with Pacific Northwest weather long ago. On the corner, a delivery driver and a building super were conducting a discussion about a parking situation that had clearly been conducted at this location many times before with no apparent expectation of resolution. Ordinary things, unremarkable, unremarked upon happening constantly. She began to walk. 2 blocks out, she stopped at a crosswalk and took out her phone. She opened the email. Read it one final time, the careful language, the third attempt, the professional restraint that barely contained the genuine need behind it. She thought about what she had written in the private document, the distinction she had finally located between obligation and choice, the difference between carrying something because the weight of it had always been hers and carrying it because she had looked at it clearly and decided it was worth carrying. She closed the email without responding. She put the phone in her bag. Not no, not yes, not yet. The answer was forming from the material the morning had provided, and it would be ready when it was ready, and she would give it when it was, and it would be the right answer because it would be the one she had actually made rather than the one she had arrived at by default or exhaustion or the accumulated pressure of 3 notices and 11 days of avoidance. She had time. The light changed. She stepped off the curb and walked. The city moved around her in all its ordinary irreplaceability. A child stopped dead on the sidewalk to examine a crack in the pavement, with the total absorption of a person who has discovered something significant, while her mother waited beside her with the particular patience of someone who has learned not to rush the moments when a small person is genuinely paying attention to the world. A man held a door for an elderly woman he had never met, received her nod, continued on his way, and neither of them would give it another thought. Small things, the texture of a morning, the unorchestrated, unremarkable fact of people going about their lives in proximity to each other, occasionally briefly making it slightly easier for one another. She had spent 20 years in the extraordinary and the elevated stakes, high consequence, historically significant, and she carried that. She would always carry it, but she was walking now through the ordinary, through the streets of a city going about its Tuesday business, and the ordinary did not feel this morning like a lesser thing. She thought about Theo in his chair, building the first hour of a different direction. She thought about Calder Briggs wherever he was now, with a 3.91 GPA, and 4 years of wrong turns in a piece of paper making its way to him through Garrett in the slow machinery of process. She did not know what he would do with the phone number. She had learned across 20 years that you could not make that choice for another person. You could put the door there. You could make sure it was findable. The walking through it was entirely theirs. But you put the door there. That was the part that was yours. And she had learned also that the part that was yours was not nothing. It was in fact precisely as much as you were responsible for, no more, no less. And the people who burned themselves out were almost always the ones who had confused those boundaries, who had taken on the part that was not theirs and exhausted themselves on it. She thought about Walt, about Eleanor and the wallet, about the letter 53 years and 7 months in the making, now folded beside the photograph traveling together wherever Walt carried them. She turned a corner. Portland opened ahead, wet and gold, and fully itself continuing its enormous ongoing life, with the indifference of a city that has seen considerable history and intends to see more, and in which this particular Tuesday was simply one entry in a very long record. She was part of it. She had been part of it every morning. She had sat at that corner table trying to figure out who she was when no one was requiring her to be anything in particular. She had been so occupied with the question that she had failed to notice she was already someone, that the person who had been built over 20 years did not disappear or become irrelevant when the context that built her changed. It persisted. It showed up. It had shown up this morning in a coffee shop in the Pearl District on an unremarkable Tuesday and done what it was made to do without apology and without announcement, because that was what it did. She kept walking. The answer to the email would come. She was no longer afraid of what it would be. She was no longer afraid of what it said about her, whichever direction it went. She had spent 2 years making the question too large and loading it with implications it was not required to carry, as though the answer defined her, as though choosing one direction over the other settled something permanent and irreversible about who she was and what she was worth. It didn't. She was not what she chose next. She was what she brought to the choosing. And she knew now with a clarity that felt like something given, rather than something arrived at what she brought. 20 years of becoming something specific. 2 years of learning that specific things can grow without losing what they are. One morning in Portland that had reminded her without asking permission of what she had always been. She walked on through the October light. Behind her in his corner booth at the grindstone, Walt Calloway sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone slightly cool. His eyes moved from the window to the room and back to the window, unhurried, open to whatever the next thing would be. On the table in front of him, his pen lay at a precise right angle to the edge. Set down the way you set something down when the work is finished. When what needed saying has been said, when what needed doing is done, and what comes next is simply the next thing available and unwritten, waiting to be whatever it will be. Outside, the October light moved through Portland the way it always moved, without agenda, without explanation, falling equally on everything, turning nothing into something else, simply illuminating what was already there, available to anyone paying close enough attention to receive it. Renata Voss walked through it. She had always been that person. She was deciding now to stop pretending otherwise.